All right, here we go. Today we have presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr., son of Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, nephew of President John F. Kennedy. Welcome to VladTV.
Vlad, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, you have a very long history that actually starts before you were born. So I want to get into all that before we begin and tell your story. So you're part of the legendary Kennedy family, and your grandfather is Joseph Kennedy.
Yes.
And he had some pretty famous kids. He had John F. Kennedy, who was the 35th president of the United States, longtime Senator Ted Kennedy, and Attorney General and Senator Robert F. Kennedy, a.k.a. Bobby Kennedy, who is your father. So do you have any memory of your grandfather growing up?
Yeah. All of us were very close. The family was very close-knit. So my grandfather had 9 kids. He had how 2 of the kids died during World War II, and 1 immediately after. My Uncle Joe was killed on he volunteered for what essentially was a suicide mission. He had completed all of his, he was on his way home. He had been a pilot out of England, flying over Germany and over the Channel. And he had volunteered for a mission to fly the first remote-controlled airplane, which they had turned into a flying bomb. And they were going to he had to take it off. And then they were going to send it into the submarine pens off of Scandinavia, to the Nazi submarine pens. And his job was to take it off, get it at altitude, and another plane that was flying next to him, the companion plane, would turn on the remote control and take over the controls of the plane. Then he was supposed to parachute out. As soon as they turned it on, it sparked the bombs in it, and it disintegrated the plane immediately, and he was not found. He died during the war, and my aunt died immediately after the war in an airplane crash. The 7 kids that were left were all around Hyannis Port. So my grandfather bought a house in Hyannis Port in 1928. He had been the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He had been one of 10 millionaires in this country during the Great Depression. He was a banker. He owned a movie studio in one of the biggest movie studios in Hollywood, or he was the CEO of it and the biggest owner. And then he had, as I said, 9 kids. He raised them. They all had houses around his house. So that was what is called the Kennedy compound. My father bought the first of those houses. My father was one of the younger kids, was the first to get married. He had 11 kids. So I have 10 siblings, 2 of whom have died. And I grew up with my grandfather. My grandfather took us horseback riding every day. I went out he had a boat called the Marlin. It's a cabin cruiser, and we went on some boats every day. So a lot of the family had boats, and but a lot of us went with my grandfather every day. And so we had dinner with him at least one night a week, with him and my grandmother, Rose Kennedy. Incidentally, his father was a political operative. He was a ward boss for the Democratic Party in Boston. And my other great-grandfather, Rose Kennedy's father, was Honey Fitz, who was the first Irish Catholic mayor of Boston.
Okay, and like you mentioned, your grandfather was extremely wealthy. The first president of the SEC. He also owned this huge building. It was like the biggest building in America.
Yeah, he owned the biggest building other than the Pentagon, which is the Merchandise Mart in Chicago.
Now, I just want to address this rumor because, from what I understand, it's not true, but there was always the rumor that he was involved in liquor bootlegging. Liquor bootlegging.
Yeah, he was not.
Right. From what I understand, from what I read, that he actually did start to export liquor after it became legal. So he wasn't actually doing it when it was illegal during the whole kind of the criminal part of it.
When the way that prohibition ended, prohibition was very unpopular among the Irish, particularly.
Right.
And in urban populations, it was a rural impulse, and not, in the urban populations, it was extremely unpopular. So, but my grandfather, and by the way, my grandfather went through 3 presidential appointments, including the head of the SEC, and he had a high job up in the shipbuilding for the United States Navy, and he was the ambassador to the Court of St. James to England. He had to go through Senate hearings in each one. If he had had anything to do with the liquor industry or with prohibition, he had so many political enemies, and that would have come out.
Yeah.
The way that prohibition ended is you had to have, I think you had 26 states had to disavow prohibition in order to alter the Constitution.
Yeah.
So when it got close to those 23 or 26, they knew it was coming. So he went over to Scotland and he bought Pinch vodka, or Pinch whiskey, which was one of the premier whiskey companies.
Mm-hmm.
He did it with James Roosevelt, who was the president's son.
Okay.
The two of them bought it, and then they imported to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much, but a lot of the stuff. So it was at warehouses right next to the U.S. border. So the second that prohibition ended, all the liquor came. Now, he was never accused of being a bootlegger until after he had his stroke and couldn't defend himself, and my uncle was killed. Uh-huh. It was 1964, and there was at that point, the CIA was trying to, let's say, disparage the rumors that they may have had something to do with President Kennedy's assassination. There was a big effort that was run by an individual in the CIA who had been the New York Times bureau chief in Havana. And his job for the next 30 years was blackening the Kennedy name. And that is one of the rumors that he started at that time. And it was in order to promote this story that my uncle had been killed by the Mafia because he had double-crossed them, because the Giancana mob had helped him win Chicago. And then my father had prosecuted Sam Giancana and put 600 people in jail from that mob and from, the Trafficante and Carlos Marcello organizations, and that this was their revenge. So this is a nonsense story that makes no sense. In fact, when I was a little kid, in 1959, I went to, and there's pictures of me sitting in the Senate hearing room on my mother's lap in the front row. My father eviscerated Sam Giancana. So Sam Giancana, I think, took the fifth 50 times in front of my father. My father ridiculed him. My father asked him, do you hang people from who cross you from meat hooks? Have you done that? He giggled, and my father said, "You're giggling like a little girl, aren't you? Like a little girl." So Sam Giancana did not like my father. Now, what people are saying is 6 months after that hearing, somehow my father was Jack Kennedy's campaign manager. Somehow my father then cuts a deal with Sam Giancana, who he ridiculed, who he's putting in jail, who he's attacked for years, and they make up, and Sam Giancana gives my uncle the White House. It doesn't make any sense. Right. Not only that, but the people accuse another rumor that was circulating at the time was that my uncle won the presidency by conniving with Mayor Daley to fix the Chicago vote. Well, Mayor Daley fixed the Chicago vote for the lower ballot candidates all the time, so nobody disagrees with that. The problem with this is that after that vote, first of all, after the vote, Mayor Daley was so outraged about these accusations that my uncle had won unfairly that he offered to do a recount and pay for it himself. he also, even if my uncle had lost Illinois, he would have still won the presidency. So it is what it is.
It is what it is. Right. Because the rumor was always, and even when I interview Mafia guys like Michael Franzese, it was like, okay, so the grandfather was the bootlegger who worked with the Mafia, and then the Mafia helped John F. Kennedy become president. And then when Bobby went after the Mafia, they felt betrayed. So they, killed John F. Kennedy and so forth.
Yeah. And
you've heard this a million times.
I've heard it a million times. Everybody and there's a lot of writers out there who would have liked to find some evidence. There's a guy called David Horowitz who spent years looking for that evidence and finally said, yeah, it's not there. It didn't happen. My uncle had nothing to do with it. My uncle at that, right out of high school, he became the youngest bank president in the country. He wasn't bootlegging. He had a very visible life with eyeballs on him my grandfather all the time. And then he went right into politics. So, if he had he had a lot of enemies on Wall Street, all over the country. If he had been a bootlegger at any point in his life, that would have been found out at the time and would have been used against him a million times. And there's no place in his life. His life is very well known. And there's no place in his life that could have happened.